Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. This is my story, one I never thought I'd share, but maybe someone out there needs to hear it. What happened to me changed everything I believed in, about love, trust, and betrayal. So, here it goes. It was our 15th anniversary, a milestone I'd been looking forward to for months. 15 years. It felt like a lifetime, a comfortable, well-worn pair of shoes. Or so I thought. Veronica, my wife, had been acting a little different in the weeks leading up to it. More secretive, a little distant, but she'd brushed it off as planning a special surprise. She kept saying she wanted us to try something new this year, something to really shake things up and celebrate us. I'll admit, a part of me was intrigued. Another, smaller part, felt a knot of unease I couldn't quite name. I figured it was a surprise trip, maybe some elaborate romantic gesture, something to reignite a spark that, if I was honest with myself, had dimmed a little over the past year or two. Not catastrophically, just the normal settling that happens after so long together. We had a good life, or so I believed. A nice house in a quiet suburb, 2 kids, Emily and Josh, both in their early teens, and a routine that, while sometimes monotonous, was also comforting. We were Mark and Veronica, a team, the couple everyone thought had it all figured out. I certainly thought we did. Veronica was, or I believed her to be, my rock, my confidant, the person who knew me better than anyone else in the world. The idea of her wanting to inject some novelty into our anniversary felt, on the surface, like a good thing, a sign that she was still invested, still wanted to put in the effort. God, how wrong I was. That phrase, try something new, now echoes in my mind like a curse, a harbinger of the moment my entire world fractured. I remember thinking about what it could be. Maybe she'd booked one of those fancy chef's table experiences, or perhaps a weekend getaway to that little coastal town we'd always talked about visiting. I even idly wondered if she'd bought some adventurous lingerie, something to spice things up in the bedroom. We hadn't been as intimate as we used to be, but I'd chalked it up to stress, kids, the general wear and tear of a long-term marriage. I wasn't overly concerned. Every couple went through phases, right? The slight increase in her late nights at work, attributed to a big project, the way she'd angle her phone away from me sometimes. I'd noticed, but I hadn't seen. I'd chosen not to see. It's incredible, the things your mind will rationalize when the alternative is too devastating to contemplate. I trusted her. Implicitly. That was the bedrock of our marriage, the one thing I never questioned. So, I pushed down that niggling feeling of unease and focused on the anticipation. She'd told me to keep the evening free, that she'd handle everything. The kids were staying over at her sister's, which was a common occurrence when we wanted a night to ourselves. It all seemed perfectly normal, perfectly planned for a special anniversary. The day itself started out fine. We exchanged cards, a little more perfunctory than in years past, perhaps, but still, the ritual was there. I got her a necklace she'd admired a few weeks before. She gave me a new watch, a very nice one. A little something to mark the time, all the good times we've had, and all the good times to come, she'd said, smiling. That smile, was it genuine? Or was it a mask, expertly worn? I can't tell anymore. Looking back, everything is tainted, every memory filtered through the lens of what I now know. As evening approached, she told me she was making dinner at home, another surprise, as I usually did most of the cooking. She shooed me out of the kitchen, telling me to relax, have a drink. The house smelled incredible, some exotic spices I didn't recognize. She was dressed up, too, in a new dress I hadn't seen before, a deep crimson that clung to her in all the right places. She looked beautiful, and I told her so. That knot of unease had loosened a little. Maybe this was just her way of pulling out all the stops. Maybe that something new was just a renewed effort, a recommitment. I allowed myself to hope, to believe that this was going to be a wonderful, memorable anniversary. We ate dinner in the dining room, which we rarely used. Candles flickered, soft music played. It was all very romantic, meticulously orchestrated. But there was still something in her eyes, a nervous energy I couldn't quite decipher. She kept glancing at the clock, at her phone, which she'd placed face down on the table beside her. "Everything okay?" I asked at one point. "Perfect," she'd replied, a little too quickly. "Just excited for later." She'd drawn out the word later with a suggestive little smile. I felt a flicker of excitement myself then, thinking my earlier, more intimate guess about this something new might be on the mark. We finished dinner, and she suggested we move to the living room. "I have one more part to the surprise," she said, her voice a little breathless. This was it, I thought. The grand finale. I settled on the couch, a glass of wine in my hand, watching her as she paced a little, a strange mixture of nervousness and an almost unsettling excitement on her face. She wrung her hand slightly, then took a deep breath. "Okay, Mark," she began, her voice a little shaky. "You know, I've been talking about us trying something new, something to expand our horizons as a couple." I nodded, waiting. The anticipation was building, but now, that old knot of unease was back, tighter than before. There was an intensity in her gaze that made me uncomfortable. "Well," she continued, biting her lip, "I've put a lot of thought into this, and I really think it could be amazing for us. It's about being open, about exploring different facets of our connection." My mind was racing. What was she talking about? Some kind of therapy? A new hobby together? It sounded so clinical, so unlike the romantic Veronica I knew. Then she said the words that would forever be burned into my memory. "So, for our anniversary, to really try something new, I've invited someone to join us." I must have looked completely blank, because she rushed on. "Someone I've gotten to know, someone who understands this kind of thing, and who can help us explore." I just stared at her. Invited someone to join us? For what? My heart started to pound, a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. This wasn't making sense. "Join us? How, Veronica?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. She smiled then, a bright, almost manic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "In every way, Mark. Tonight. He'll be here any minute." And just as those words left her lips, the doorbell rang. The sound of the doorbell sliced through the charged atmosphere of the living room, an ordinary sound signaling something that was about to become profoundly, irrevocably extraordinary in the worst possible way. I was still trying to process Veronica's words. Invited someone to join us. In every way. It felt like my brain had short-circuited. I couldn't connect those phrases to any reality I understood, especially not the reality of our 15-year marriage, our comfortable, predictable life. Veronica, however, seemed galvanized by the chime. That nervous energy I'd seen in her earlier coalesced into a strange sort of determined excitement. She smoothed down her crimson dress, a gesture that looked rehearsed, almost performative, and hurried towards the front door. I remained on the couch, frozen, my wine glass still in my hand, the liquid trembling slightly. It was like watching a scene from a surreal movie, one where I was an unwilling participant, a bewildered spectator to the unfolding of my own life's demolition. I could hear muffled voices from the hallway, Veronica's, a little higher pitched than usual, and then a deeper, male voice I didn't recognize. My mind was a maelstrom of confusion and a rapidly dawning horror. What was happening? What had she done? This couldn't be what I was starting to suspect it was. Not Veronica. Not us. Then they walked back into the living room, and the world tilted on its axis. Veronica was beaming, almost giddily, her hand resting on the arm of a man I'd never seen before. He was tall, maybe a few years younger than us, dressed in smart casual clothes, dark jeans, a fitted shirt. He had that kind of blandly handsome look that wouldn't stand out in a crowd, but in the context of my living room, on my anniversary, next to my wife, he was the most grotesque and terrifying sight I had ever beheld. He offered a polite, almost smug smile in my direction. "Mark, this is Julian," Veronica said, her voice bright and airy, as if she were introducing a new business associate or a distant cousin. "Julian, this is my husband, Mark." Julian extended a hand towards me. "Pleasure to meet you, Mark," he said, his voice smooth, confident. "Veronica's told me a lot about you." I just stared at his outstretched hand, unable to move, unable to speak. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. My gaze flickered from Julian's expectant face to Veronica's beaming one. She looked so proud, so pleased with herself, as if she'd just presented me with the most wonderful gift imaginable. The disconnect between her apparent joy and the cold dread gripping my insides was disorienting. What is this, Veronica?" I finally managed to choke out, my voice hoarse. My eyes were locked on hers, pleading for an explanation that would make sense, that would somehow undo this horrifying tableau. Veronica's smile faltered slightly at my tone, a flicker of something, annoyance, impatience, crossing her face. "This is it, Mark. This is the something new I was telling you about. Julian is here to join us. For the evening. To help us celebrate. To explore a new dimension of our intimacy." Intimacy. The word felt obscene in this context. Julian lowered his hand, a knowing little smirk playing on his lips. He seemed completely at ease, as if being introduced as an anniversary threesome participant was an everyday occurrence for him. My mind finally caught up, the horrifying reality crashing down on me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't some bizarre joke. My wife, Veronica, had invited another man into our home, into our marriage, on our 15th anniversary, with the expectation that I would just go along with it. The shock was quickly followed by a surge of white-hot anger, so intense it made me tremble. "Are you out of your mind?" I exploded, a sudden roar that made Veronica flinch and Julian's smirk vanish, replaced by a look of mild surprise. I stood up, my legs unsteady. "You invited another man? Into our bed? On our anniversary? Is that what this is?" Veronica's face hardened. "Don't be so dramatic, Mark. It's not like that. It's about connection, about openness. I thought you'd be open to new experiences. For us. For our marriage. Open to this?" I gestured wildly between her and Julian, who was now watching me with a detached curiosity. "This isn't openness, Veronica. This is a betrayal. How could you even think?" My voice cracked. The hurt was starting to eclipse the anger, a deep, tearing pain in my chest. Julian decided this was his moment to interject. "Look, Mark," he said, his tone placating, like he was dealing with an unruly child. "Veronica and I have been discussing this for a while. She felt your relationship could use a spark, some excitement. I'm just here to facilitate that. No pressure. We can all just relax, have a drink, talk about it. You shut up." I snarled at him, taking a step forward. "You have no right to be in my house, no right to talk about my marriage." I turned back to Veronica, my heart hammering. "Discussing this for a while? How long, Veronica? How long has this been going on behind my back?" Her eyes darted away, a clear sign of guilt. "It's not going on, Mark. We've been talking. Online mostly. Julian understands these dynamics. He's experienced. Experienced." The word was like another knife twist. So this wasn't some spontaneous, harebrained idea. This was planned. Calculated. She'd been communicating with this stranger, this Julian, discussing the perceived shortcomings of our marriage, our intimacy, and plotting this ambush. The scale of the deception was staggering. All those late nights, the secretive phone calls, her slight emotional distance, it all clicked into place, forming a sickening mosaic of lies. "I want him out of here," I said, my voice low and shaking with suppressed fury. Now, Veronica looked aghast. Mark, don't be like this. He's our guest. I invited him. This was supposed to be special, a new beginning for us. A new beginning? I laughed, a harsh, broken sound. Are you listening to yourself? You bring another man into our home on our anniversary, and you call it a new beginning? It's the end, Veronica. Can't you see that? The confident facade she'd been wearing was starting to crumble. Tears welled in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy, only a cold, hard anger. These weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of frustration that her grand plan was derailing. But I did this for us, she whispered, as if that somehow justified the monumental betrayal. I thought it would make things exciting again. I read about it. Lots of couples do it. It strengthens their bond. We are not lots of couples, Veronica. I shouted. We were us. And you've destroyed that. You've destroyed everything. I looked at Julian, who was now looking distinctly uncomfortable, his earlier confidence gone. Get out, I said to him, my voice deadly calm, before I call the police and have you removed for trespassing. He glanced at Veronica, who looked torn and desperate. Maybe I should go, he mumbled, clearly not prepared for this level of confrontation. He had probably expected a hesitant but ultimately compliant husband, not this enraged, heartbroken man. No. Julian, wait, Veronica pleaded, grabbing his arm. But I'd had enough. This charade, this horrifying spectacle, was over. If he doesn't leave, Veronica, I said, my voice like ice, then I will. And when I do, I'm calling a lawyer. You can explain to them, and to our children, about your idea of a new beginning. The mention of the children, of lawyers, seemed to finally penetrate her delusional state. Her face went pale. Julian, seeing his cue, gently disengaged his arm from her grasp. I think it's best if I head off, he said, already backing towards the hallway. This was clearly not the right time. He didn't even glance at me as he practically fled the house. Veronica watched him go, her shoulders slumping. The front door clicked shut, and an oppressive silence descended, broken only by my ragged breathing and Veronica's quiet, hiccuping sobs. She turned to me, her face a mess of tears and makeup. Mark, please, she began. But I held up a hand. Don't, I said, my voice devoid of any emotion I recognized. Just don't. There's nothing you can say. The beautiful dress, the romantic dinner, the carefully constructed illusion of a special anniversary, it all lay in ruins around us, meaningless props and a tragedy she had authored. The man she'd invited was gone, but his presence lingered, a toxic contamination in the air of our home, in the space between us, in the shattered remnants of our 15 years together. This something new she had wanted had arrived, and it was the utter devastation of everything I held sacred. The hours that followed Julian's hasty departure were a blur of cold silence and searing pain. Veronica tried to speak, to explain, to apologize, but her words were like a foreign language I no longer understood, or perhaps no longer wanted to understand. Each syllable felt like another layer of deceit, another attempt to manipulate a situation that was, for me, irrevocably broken. I couldn't even look at her. The woman I had loved, or thought I had loved, for half my life, suddenly seemed like a stranger, a dangerous imposter wearing Veronica's face. I retreated to the spare bedroom, the one we usually kept for guests, though ironically, tonight it was I who felt like the unwelcome visitor in my own home. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Julian's smug face, Veronica's excited smile as she presented him, the horrifying realization dawning on me. The image of them together, the thought of what she had intended for our anniversary night, played on a loop in my mind, each repetition a fresh stab of agony. How could she believe, even for a second, that this was something I would want, something our marriage needed? The sheer arrogance, the profound lack of respect for me, for what we had built, was staggering. It wasn't just about the introduction of another man. It was about the months, or however long it had been, of lies, of secret conversations, of planning this betrayal behind my back. My entire reality felt like it had been built on quicksand. Were there other lies? Other secrets? How much of our life together had been a facade? The questions gnawed at me, relentless and cruel. The next morning, the house felt like a mausoleum. I emerged from the spare room to find Veronica sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and swollen from crying. She looked up as I entered, her eyes pleading. "Mark, we need to talk," she said, her voice hoarse. I just shook my head. "There's nothing to talk about, Veronica," I replied, my voice flat, devoid of the rage from the night before, replaced by a chilling emptiness. "You made your choices. You showed me what you think of me, of us." I told her I was going to stay with my brother, Michael, for a few days. I needed space, I needed to think, I needed to be anywhere but in that house, breathing the same air as her. She protested, begged me to stay, to work through it. She said it was a mistake, a terrible misjudgment, that she wasn't thinking clearly. But the words rang hollow. This wasn't a simple misjudgment, like choosing the wrong paint color for the living room. This was a fundamental betrayal of trust, a violation of the deepest, most sacred vows we had made. Packing a bag with a few essentials felt surreal. Every object I touched, a shirt she'd bought me, a photo of us from a happier time on the nightstand, was a fresh torment. Emily and Josh were due back from her sisters later that day. The thought of facing them, of pretending everything was normal, was unbearable. What would I tell them? What would she tell them? The immediate aftermath was a descent into a personal hell. Michael was shocked, of course, but incredibly supportive. He listened without judgment as I haltingly recounted the events of our anniversary, the words feeling like shards of glass in my mouth. Just saying it out loud made it more real, more horrifyingly tangible. Staying with him gave me a temporary refuge, but it couldn't shield me from the relentless onslaught of my own thoughts. The emotional devastation was profound. I felt like a fool, duped, and humiliated. My self-esteem, which I'd always considered reasonably healthy, was in tatters. How could I have been so blind? Were the signs there all along and I'd just chosen to ignore them? Or was she that good an actress? I replayed conversations, expressions, incidents from the past year, searching for clues, for an explanation, anything to make sense of the senseless. The Veronica who had orchestrated that anniversary horror was not the Veronica I thought I knew. Was she a victim of some strange, midlife crisis delusion? Had she been manipulated by this Julian character? Or was this the real Veronica, finally emerging from behind a mask she'd worn for 15 years? I didn't know, and the uncertainty was maddening. A few days later, after the initial shock had subsided into a dull, persistent ache, I knew I had to talk to her again, not for reconciliation, but for answers, for some semblance of understanding, if such a thing was even possible. I needed to know the extent of this. I met her at a neutral location, a coffee shop. She looked terrible, like she hadn't slept or eaten properly in days. Part of me, a deeply buried, conditioned part, felt a pang of something akin to pity, but it was quickly overwhelmed by the memory of her actions. She cried, she apologized profusely, she swore it was a one-time, insane idea fueled by a desperate desire to feel alive again, to make our marriage feel exciting. She claimed Julian was just someone she'd met in an online forum dedicated to alternative relationship styles, that they'd only exchanged messages and a few calls, that he wasn't a lover, just a guide she thought could help us. I listened, my face impassive. Her excuses sounded flimsy, self-serving. "Did you sleep with him, Veronica?" I asked bluntly. The question hung in the air between us. She flinched as if I'd struck her. "No. Mark, no, never," she insisted, her eyes wide with what looked like genuine horror at the accusation. "It was never about that for me, not with him. It was about pushing boundaries, about seeing if we could evolve. Evolve." Another one of those clinical, detached words. It felt like she was reciting lines from some self-help book or a forum post. Whether she was telling the truth about not having slept with him yet, I wasn't sure I believed her. Or more accurately, I wasn't sure it mattered. The intent, the planning, the deception, that was the core of the betrayal. The physical act itself was almost secondary to the calculated destruction of my trust. But as she talked, a new, chilling thought began to form. She mentioned the online forum again, how supportive and understanding the people there were, how they advocated for total honesty and consensual exploration. It sounded like a cult. And then she let something slip, something small, but it snagged in my mind. She was talking about how Julian had reassured her that many long-term couples found this kind of exploration revitalizing, and she mentioned him referencing specific success stories from the forum, stories that sounded oddly familiar. Almost like anecdotes she herself had shared with me about fictional friends or articles she'd read in the past, months ago. A seed of deep suspicion began to sprout. This wasn't just about a forum and a stranger. The way she spoke of Julian, even in her supposed remorse, had a faint undercurrent of familiarity, or perhaps a shared understanding that predated her discovery of this online world. I started to wonder if Julian was really just a random contact from the internet. Or was he someone else? Someone closer? The idea that this deception might run deeper, that it might be more personal, more intricately woven into our lives than I could currently fathom, was a terrifying prospect. I left that coffee shop with no real closure, only more questions and a burgeoning, cold dread. Her apologies, her tears, her explanations, none of it felt real. It felt like a performance, a desperate attempt to salvage the situation, to control the narrative. I realized then that I couldn't trust anything she said. If I wanted the truth, I would have to find it myself. The thought of playing detective in my own marriage was repulsive, demeaning. But the alternative, living with the unknown, with the possibility of even greater deceptions, was unbearable. That was the moment the raw grief began to curdle into something else, something harder, colder. A resolve to uncover the full extent of her betrayal, no matter how painful the truth might be. My investigation, as it were, started small, almost tentatively. I wasn't a spy. I wasn't naturally suspicious, but Veronica had turned me into someone I didn't recognize. She was still living in the house. I was still at Michael's. We had minimal contact, mostly texts about the kids, who were confused and worried about why I wasn't home. Veronica had told them I was stressed from work and needed some space, a flimsy excuse that I knew wouldn't hold for long. I had access to our shared phone plan details online. With a nod of guilt and trepidation, I logged in. I didn't even know what I was looking for. But there it was. A recurring number, one I didn't recognize, with calls and texts exchanged frequently over the past 3, maybe 4 months. Many of them were at odd hours, late at night, during the day when she was supposedly at work. The duration of the calls wasn't excessively long, but the frequency was alarming. This wasn't just a few calls, as she'd claimed. This was regular, sustained contact. My heart sank. This Julian, or whoever this number belonged to, was more than just an online acquaintance. I did a quick reverse lookup on the number. The result came back as no name associated or private number for some, but one of the older entries from a less secure lookup site briefly flashed a name before the page fully loaded and then obscured it. I wasn't sure if I saw it correctly, but it looked like a name I vaguely recognized. A common name, but it sent a chill down my spine. I needed more than just a phone number. Veronica had always been a little careless with her old devices. Her previous laptop, the one she'd replaced about 6 months ago because it was acting slow, was still in the study, tucked away in a cupboard. She'd claimed she'd transferred everything important, but I doubted she'd wiped it properly. One evening, when I knew she was out with her sister, or so she said, I let myself into the house. It felt strange, being a furtive intruder in my own home. I found the old laptop, booted it up. It was password protected, of course. But I knew Veronica. She wasn't very creative with passwords. I tried her birthday. No. Our anniversary. No. The kids' names. No. Then, I remembered a silly nickname she had for our old cat, Whiskers, who had died years ago. Mr. Fluff. Bingo. I was in. My hands were shaking as I navigated through her old files, her browser history, her email accounts that were still logged in. It felt like a colossal violation of privacy, but the alternative, the not knowing, was worse. Her email inbox was mostly spam and newsletters. But then I checked the sent folder, the drafts, the trash. And there it was. Emails exchanged not just with one Julian, but with a small group of people in what appeared to be a private messaging group linked from that alternative lifestyle forum she'd mentioned. They discussed explorations, new paradigms in relationships, and ethical non-monogamy. It was all couched in this pseudo-intellectual, self-justifying jargon. But it was clear that Veronica had been deeply enmeshed in this world for months, far longer than she'd admitted. She wasn't a curious novice. She was an active participant, discussing her unenlightened husband, me, and her plans to bring him around, or, if necessary, move on to a more evolved partner. Reading her words, her casual dismissal of our 15 years together, her clinical discussion of my feelings as if I were some kind of experiment, was like being repeatedly punched in the gut. The betrayal was so much deeper, so much more calculated than I had ever imagined. And then I found the photo gallery. Mixed in with old family snaps were a few folders I didn't recognize. One was labeled Project New Dawn. My blood ran cold. Inside were not just discussions, but photos. Photos of Veronica. With Julian. But not the Julian I'd briefly met. The man in these photos, taken months ago, was someone else entirely. Or rather, Julian was a composite, a lie. The name that had flashed briefly on the reverse phone lookup, the common name that had chilled me. It belonged to someone we knew. Someone I had trusted. It was David. David, my supposed friend. Our kids played together. We'd shared barbecues, beers, lamented about work and mortgages. David, who was also married. His wife, Sarah, was Veronica's close friend. The man Veronica had brought into our home, Julian, was a hired actor, a stranger she'd found through that forum to play a part. The Real affair, the real something new she'd been exploring, was with David. For how long? I didn't know, but the photos weren't new. They looked happy, intimate. This wasn't about expanding horizons. This was a sordid, classic affair, dressed up in the fancy rhetoric of ethical non-monogamy to make it palatable to her, to them. The whole Julian escapade on our anniversary had been a twisted, desperate attempt to either normalize her affair, to make it seem like she was trying to include me in her new lifestyle, or perhaps even a way to test the waters, to see if I'd be amenable to an open marriage, which would then make her ongoing affair with David somehow acceptable in her warped logic. Or maybe, just maybe, it was a smokescreen, a way to introduce the idea of other men so that if David was ever discovered, it wouldn't seem like such a singular, devastating betrayal. The truth was so much uglier, so much more duplicitous than I could have imagined. She hadn't just lied to me. She had orchestrated an elaborate deception involving multiple people, all to cover up her affair with one of my friends, her friend's husband. The depth of the betrayal was bottomless. I felt sick, physically ill. The room started to spin. I closed the laptop, my mind reeling. The pain was unbearable, but beneath it, something new was forming, a cold, hard resolve. She hadn't just broken my heart. She had tried to make a fool of me, to gaslight me into accepting her treachery. She had underestimated me. And David, my friend, he would pay too. They both would. The thought wasn't about violence. It was about exposure. It was about justice. The kind of justice that strips away the lies and reveals the ugly truth for everyone to see. My grief was still there, a gaping wound, but now it was accompanied by a steely determination. They wanted to try something new. I'd give them something new. I'd give them consequences. The initial shock of discovering Veronica's affair with David, my supposed friend, was like being plunged into icy water. The sheer audacity of their deception, the layers of lies, the manipulation, it was almost too much to comprehend. For days, I walked around in a daze, the images from that old laptop burned into my retinas. Veronica and David, smiling, intimate. The chat logs discussing their evolved connection while simultaneously plotting how to manage their respective spouses, me and Sarah. The realization that the Julian incident was likely a twisted gambit, a calculated distraction, or a bizarre attempt to normalize her infidelity, made me physically ill. My grief was immense, but it was now intertwined with a cold, simmering rage. They hadn't just betrayed me, they had betrayed Sarah, their children, the very fabric of our interconnected lives. They had painted themselves as enlightened explorers of new relationship paradigms while engaging in the oldest, most common form of deceit. The hypocrisy was galling. My first instinct was to confront them immediately, to scream, to unleash the torrent of pain and anger that was consuming me. But a small, rational part of my brain, a part that was surprisingly clear amidst the emotional chaos, urged caution. A fiery confrontation might offer a moment of catharsis, but what then? It wouldn't undo the damage, and it might even allow them to twist the narrative, to paint me as unhinged, to play the victims themselves. No, I needed a plan. I needed to be strategic. This wasn't just about my emotional pain anymore. It was about protecting myself, my children, and ensuring that Veronica and David faced real, tangible consequences for their actions. The first practical step I took was to see a lawyer. I found a highly recommended divorce attorney, a woman named Ms. Albright, who specialized in complex, high-conflict separations. I laid out the whole sordid story, from the anniversary surprise with the fake Julian to the discovery of the affair with David via the old laptop. I was careful to explain how I'd accessed the laptop, concerned about the legality, but she reassured me that since it was a shared household device and the information was, in a sense, abandoned, it was unlikely to be problematic, especially in a no-fault divorce state like ours. However, she emphasized that while infidelity might not significantly impact the financial division of assets in our state, the evidence of it, and particularly evidence of financial misconduct related to the affair, like shared expenses, gifts, trips, could be very relevant. More importantly, understanding the full scope of the deception was crucial for me to make informed decisions. Ms. Albright was calm, professional, and incredibly astute. She didn't just focus on the legalities, she understood the emotional devastation. She advised me to continue gathering any further evidence I could, discreetly and legally. She also suggested I start separating my finances as much as possible and to document everything meticulously. Knowledge is power in these situations, Mark, she told me. The more you know, the better you can navigate this. And the less power they have to manipulate you. Her words resonated deeply. The feeling of powerlessness had been one of the worst aspects of this ordeal. Taking control, even in small ways, felt like a lifeline. I started to think about what kind of justice I wanted. It wasn't about ruining their lives in a vengeful, destructive way. That would only prolong my own agony and negatively impact our children. My goal was twofold. First, to ensure a fair and just divorce settlement that protected my financial future and the children's well-being, and second, to ensure that the truth of their actions was known, at least to those directly affected, so they couldn't continue to hide behind their facade of respectability and enlightened choices. I decided to adopt what I later learned was often called the gray rock method when dealing with Veronica. I became emotionally distant, unreactive to her attempts at apologies, her tears, her pleas to work things out. When we had to communicate about the kids, I kept it brief, factual, and devoid of emotion. This was incredibly difficult. There were times I wanted to scream at her, to demand answers to 1,000 more questions. But I knew that any emotional engagement would only give her an opening to manipulate me further. She seemed bewildered by my change in demeanor. She was used to me being emotionally available, perhaps even a bit of a pushover at times. My newfound detachment clearly unsettled her. Meanwhile, I continued my quiet investigation. I didn't hack into their current devices. Ms. Albright had warned me against anything that could be construed as illegal. Instead, I focused on publicly available information and on piecing together the timeline from the old laptop data. I created a detailed chronology of their affair, cross-referencing emails, chat logs, and photos with calendar entries and credit card statements. Ours were joint, so I had access to past statements. It painted a grim picture of deception that had been going on for at least a year, possibly longer. They had taken trips together, disguised as work conferences or solo getaways. There were expensive gifts, dinners at fancy restaurants I'd never been to with Veronica. The financial infidelity was as blatant as the emotional and physical betrayal. One of the most painful discoveries was realizing how often I had been lied to, not just by Veronica, but by David as well. Times when he'd called to cancel plans with me, claiming he was sick or had a family emergency, now lined up perfectly with dates I found in their private messages detailing a romantic rendezvous. My friend had looked me in the eye, shared beers with me, all while sleeping with my wife and lying to my face. The betrayal cut deep. The plan for revealing the truth began to take shape. It wouldn't be a dramatic, public shaming. That wasn't my style, and it would hurt the children too much. Instead, I decided on a more targeted approach. The first person who deserved to know the truth was Sarah, David's wife. She was, in all of this, as much a victim as I was. She was Veronica's friend, and she had been callously betrayed by both her husband and her supposed confidant. The thought of telling her was daunting. How do you deliver news that will shatter someone's world? But I knew I had to. She deserved to know who she was married to and who her friend really was. I also needed to ensure that Veronica and David couldn't control the narrative with Sarah, couldn't spin some tale where they were the misunderstood romantics and Sarah and I were the obstacles to their happiness. I compiled a concise summary of the evidence, key emails, a few damning photos, nothing too explicit, but clearly showing their intimacy and the timeline, and excerpts from their chats discussing their affair and their deception. I made sure it was irrefutable. The next step was the timing. I wanted to serve Veronica with divorce papers before I spoke to Sarah. This would make my intentions clear. Our marriage was over, and this wasn't a negotiation. Ms. Albright prepared the papers. The day I had them served was one of the hardest of my life. Veronica was at home. I wasn't there. I had a process server deliver them. She called me, hysterical, sobbing, accusing me of being cruel and heartless. I listened, said nothing, and then calmly told her that her actions had consequences and that this was the consequence of her choices. I told her we would discuss the details through our lawyers. The gray rock held, though it took every ounce of my strength. With Veronica served, the path was clear to talk to Sarah. I wrestled with how to do it. A phone call felt too impersonal, an email too cold. I decided to ask Michael, my brother, if his wife, Clara, who knew Sarah casually through school events, could arrange a quiet, private meeting with her. Clara was horrified by what I told her, but agreed to help, understanding the delicate nature of the situation. She simply told Sarah that I had something very important and sensitive to discuss with her regarding our families. Sarah, likely sensing the gravity, agreed to meet me at a quiet park cafe a few days later. Waiting for her that day, my heart pounded in my chest. I felt like an executioner, about to deliver a fatal blow. But I also felt a grim sense of duty. She deserved the truth. The meeting with Sarah was one of the most difficult conversations I've ever had. second only to the initial confrontation with Veronica. Clara had arranged for us to meet at a small, out-of-the-way cafe with a secluded patio, a place where we were unlikely to be overheard or recognized. I arrived early, a manila envelope containing the carefully curated evidence resting heavily in my lap. My stomach was in knots. I replayed what I was going to say a dozen times in my head, trying to find the least brutal way to deliver such devastating news. Sarah arrived a few minutes later. She looked puzzled, a little apprehensive. She was a kind woman, always friendly, and I'd always liked her. The thought that I was about to shatter her world filled me with a profound sadness, even amidst my own turmoil. We exchanged polite, awkward greetings. She asked if everything was okay with me, with Veronica, with the kids. Her innocent concern was like a knife to my heart. I took a deep breath. "Sarah," I began, my voice a little shaky despite my efforts to remain calm. "Thank you for meeting me. There's something very difficult I need to tell you. It's about Veronica, and it's about David." Her brow furrowed in confusion. "David? What about David and Veronica?" I didn't preamble further. I knew drawing it out would only make it worse. "Sarah, I recently discovered that Veronica has been having an affair. And it's with David." The color drained from her face. She stared at me, her eyes wide with disbelief, then a dawning horror. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, that's not possible." "David? Veronica? They're friends. We're friends." "I know this is a shock," I said gently, pushing the envelope across the table towards her. "I wouldn't be telling you this if I wasn't absolutely certain. I have proof, Sarah. I'm so sorry, but you deserve to know the truth." Her hands trembled as she reached for the envelope. She hesitated for a long moment, then slowly opened it. I watched her face as she looked through the printouts, the emails, the chat excerpts, the photos. Each page seemed to deepen the pain in her eyes. There were no histrionics, no loud denials, just a silent, gut-wrenching crumbling. Tears began to stream down her face, unchecked. I felt a wave of empathy for her pain mirroring my own from just a few weeks prior. How long?" she finally choked out, her voice barely audible. "From what I can piece together, at least a year. Possibly more," I replied, keeping my voice as steady and factual as I could. She closed her eyes, a shudder running through her. "A year. He lied to me. They both lied to me. All this time." She looked up at me, her gaze filled with a raw, unutterable anguish. "The Julian thing. Veronica told me about that. She said it was some crazy idea she had, that you were angry, that she'd made a terrible mistake, but that you were trying to work through it. She made it sound like she was the victim of her own foolishness, and that David was just a supportive friend to both of you through this." The manipulation ran even deeper than I thought. Veronica had preemptively spun a narrative to Sarah, inoculating her against any potential rumors, painting herself as misguided but ultimately still a friend. The audacity was breathtaking. "The Julian incident was a lie, Sarah," I said quietly. "Or at least, a smokescreen. A hired actor. The real betrayal was happening with David, long before that night." Sarah let out a sound that was halfway between a sob and a gasp. He was with her on our anniversary last month," she whispered, a look of sudden, horrifying realization dawning. "He said he had to work late, a critical project. We were supposed to go out." My heart ached for her. The casual cruelty of it, the way they had trampled over sacred moments and cherished traditions with their deceit. We sat in silence for a while, Sarah trying to absorb the enormity of the betrayal, me giving her the space to process. I told her about the divorce papers I'd served Veronica. I told her I wasn't looking to cause more pain, but that I believed she had a right to know so she could make her own informed decisions. She thanked me, her voice thick with tears. She said she didn't know what she was going to do, but that she was grateful for the truth, however devastating. She asked if she could keep the evidence. I told her, of course, it was hers as much as mine. As I left her there, her shoulders slumped, the weight of the world seemingly upon them, I didn't feel triumphant. There was no satisfaction in her pain, only a shared, grim understanding of the wreckage our spouses had caused. The justice here wasn't about reveling in her suffering, but about empowering her with the truth, the same truth I had fought to uncover. The next part of the plan involved confronting Veronica and David, not together, but individually, now that Sarah knew. My confrontation with Veronica was brief and conducted with Ms. Albright present. It wasn't a screaming match. It was a calm, factual statement of what I knew and what I was prepared to do. I laid out the evidence of her affair with David, the financial infidelity, the elaborate deceptions. Her face, when she realized I knew everything, not just about Julian, but about David, was a mask of shock and then, finally, a sort of weary defeat. The fight seemed to drain out of her. She tried to apologize again, to explain, but with Ms. Albright there, her usual emotional manipulations fell flat. We focused on the terms of the divorce, custody of the kids. We agreed on joint, with me having primary physical custody for stability, which she surprisingly didn't fight hard on, division of assets. The evidence of her spending on the affair gave Ms. Albright significant leverage in ensuring a fair settlement for me, particularly regarding assets Veronica might have tried to claim were solely hers. The confrontation with David was different. I chose to do it alone, man to man, so to speak, though he had long forfeited any claim to that title in my eyes. I met him at his office, unannounced. He was surprised, then visibly unnerved, to see me. I didn't raise my voice. I simply told him that I knew everything. About him and Veronica. About the lies, the trips, the deception. I told him Sarah knew. His reaction was telling. First, denial. Then, when he realized the extent of my knowledge, a pathetic attempt at justification, talking about an unhappy marriage, a deep connection with Veronica he couldn't deny. I cut him off. Save it, David, I said, my voice cold. You're not some romantic hero. You're a liar and a cheat. You betrayed your wife, your kids, and you betrayed my friendship. There's nothing noble about what you did. He visibly deflated. The smugness I'd seen in the Julian character and the arrogance in his secret messages with Veronica were gone, replaced by a look of fear and shame. I told him I had no interest in a public spectacle, but that his actions would have consequences. I left him there, stewing in the mess he had created. The fallout for them was significant. Sarah, armed with the truth, confronted David. From what I heard later through the grapevine, our social circles, though damaged, still had overlaps. Their marriage imploded. She filed for divorce shortly after our meeting. David's reputation in our community, once that of a friendly, respectable family man, was shattered. People talk, and the truth, even when whispered, has a way of spreading. Veronica, too, found herself isolated. Many of our mutual friends, once they learned the full story, not from me directly, but inevitably, pieces of it got out, likely through Sarah's side or Veronica's own attempts to garner sympathy which backfired when the truth was known, distanced themselves from her. Her attempts to portray herself as a victim of a stale marriage who was just seeking personal growth were seen for the self-serving justifications they were. The Julian story, when the context of the Real affair became clearer to people, just made her look manipulative and slightly unhinged. There was no grand, dramatic revenge scene like in the movies. But there was justice. The justice of the truth coming to light. The justice of them having to face the real-world consequences of their choices, stripped of their romantic delusions and self-serving narratives. Their affair, which they had probably imagined as some exciting, clandestine escape, ended up costing them their marriages, their reputations, and a great deal of pain. They had sought to try something new, and in the end, they had succeeded only in destroying what they had. For me, the execution of this plan wasn't about inflicting pain for pain's sake. It was about reclaiming my dignity, protecting my interests, and ensuring that the truth prevailed over their carefully constructed lies. It was about drawing a line and saying, "No more. You will not do this to me. You will not do this to others." It was a painful, messy, and exhausting process, but it was also, in a strange way, empowering. I had taken control of a situation designed to make me a victim, and I had navigated it on my own terms. The satisfaction wasn't in their downfall, but in my own survival and the quiet assertion of truth. The dust from the explosion Veronica and David detonated in our lives took a long time to settle. The divorce proceedings were emotionally draining, even with Ms. Albright's expert guidance. Every meeting, every document signed, was a reminder of the 15 years that had been built on a foundation I now knew was riddled with cracks, and eventually, outright deceit. There were days I felt an overwhelming sadness, a grief for the marriage I thought I had, for the future I had envisioned. There were other days I felt a lingering anger, a bitterness at the sheer senselessness of their betrayal. But slowly, very slowly, those raw emotions began to dull, replaced by a kind of weary acceptance and, eventually, a quiet determination to rebuild. Life after the divorce was different, quieter for one. The house felt too big for just me and the kids, Emily and Josh, who were now with me most of the time. Explaining the divorce to them, without demonizing their mother but also without excusing her behavior, was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. We settled on a version of the truth that focused on an irreparable breakdown of trust between their parents, omitting the more sordid details of the affair and the Julian incident, at least for now, while they were still young. They were confused, hurt, and angry, and it took months of patience, reassurance, and a few sessions of family counseling to help them adjust to their new reality. Seeing their pain, a direct consequence of Veronica's choices, was perhaps the most enduring sting of the whole affair. But through it all, my relationship with Emily and Josh deepened. We became a tighter unit, relying on each other, finding new routines, new ways to be a family. I learned to be a more present father, juggling work and single parenthood, and in that, I found a new sense of purpose. As for Veronica, her life also changed dramatically. The grand, evolved future she had envisioned with David never materialized. Their affair, exposed and stripped of its secrecy, couldn't withstand the harsh light of reality and the weight of the damage they had caused. From what I heard, their relationship ended acrimoniously not long after both their divorces were finalized. She moved into a smaller apartment. Her social circle shrank. Some of her attempts to reach out to me, ostensibly about the kids but often veering into tearful apologies and regrets, were met with my continued gray rock stance. I wasn't interested in her apologies anymore. I was interested in peace and moving forward. The lessons learned from this whole ordeal were profound and painful. I learned that trust, once broken so catastrophically, is almost impossible to fully rebuild. I learned that people you believe you know intimately can be capable of shocking deception. I learned that the shiny veneer of a perfect marriage or a respectable friend can hide deep ugliness. But I also learned a lot about myself. I learned that I was stronger than I thought. I had faced the ultimate betrayal and, while scarred, I hadn't been destroyed. I had navigated a horrific situation with a dignity and resolve I didn't know I possessed. I learned the importance of vigilance, not in a paranoid way, but in the sense of not taking things for granted, of paying attention to the subtle shifts in a relationship, of trusting my gut when something feels off. I dismissed too many small red flags with Veronica, attributing them to stress or her quirks, when in reality, they were likely indicators of a deeper problem. The process of healing was slow, nonlinear. There were good days and bad days. I threw myself into work, into being a father, into reconnecting with friends who had stood by me, like my brother Michael. I started exercising more, eating healthier, focusing on my own well-being for the first time in a long time. I even started therapy, something I would have scoffed at before. Talking to a neutral professional helped me process the trauma, understand my own patterns, and develop healthier coping mechanisms. It wasn't about blaming Veronica entirely. It was about understanding my part in the dynamic of our marriage, even if her betrayal was solely her responsibility. Looking back, the Julian incident, that bizarre anniversary surprise, was the catalyst that exposed a rot that had been festering for a long time. In a twisted way, perhaps Veronica's ill-conceived plan did us both a favor. It brought the truth to light, however brutally, and prevented years more of living a lie. I wouldn't wish that kind of discovery on anyone, but it forced an ending that was, perhaps, inevitable. It forced me onto a new path, one I wouldn't have chosen, but one that ultimately led to a more authentic life. Today, a couple of years have passed. The raw wound has healed into a scar, a permanent reminder of what happened, but one that no longer aches with the same intensity. I'm still single. I've been on a few dates, but I'm taking things slowly, cautiously. My priority is my kids and my own peace of mind. I'm not sure if I'll ever trust someone as completely as I once trusted Veronica, but I'm open to the possibility of love again, someday, with someone who values honesty and respect as much as I now do. I've found a measure of peace. My life is smaller in some ways, but it's also more real, more my own. The experience changed me, stripped away a certain naivety, but it also revealed a strength I didn't know I had. I survived. I rebuilt. And in that, there is a quiet kind of victory. Veronica wanted to try something new. She got it. And in the end, so did I. A new life, built from the ashes of the old one, stronger, wiser, and undeniably my own. Looking back, I realize I lost a part of myself, but I also found something stronger. If you've ever been betrayed, know this: you're not alone, and healing is possible. Thank you for listening to my story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more real stories like this one. Until next time, take care of yourself.